In this video, we're going to be talking about creating RESTful routes. The first place we need to go is our routes.swift file. If we look in here, we'll see some sample routes already given to us. Now the first thing we need to look at with regards to routing is that all routing starts with a router object. The router object is an instance of this router. You can actually go in and take a look. Right? Router protocol, this service. Now, routing is pretty simple. Once you have the router object, you then specify the HTTP method. Now, you may be familiar with the GET method, which is the most basic one. And the GET method effectively tells us, give me this resource. There's also the POST, which indicates to create one. As you can imagine, delete, patch, to update in some way. Now we're going to start off with this getPost method. Our next step is to open up this closure, and it gives us a request. This object allows us to analyze what is actually coming in from a user's request. The internet typically works based around this request-response cycle. To complete this cycle, we need to return a message showing all posts. Let's run this. We've seen that it succeeded. Let's go to localhost 8080/post. So let's go to /post. And there we have it. We can see all of our posts. Let's take this one step further. Returning a string is okay, but more than likely we might want to return some JSON instead. This can be done by using what is called the content protocol. Let's define a struct, and we're going to name the struct context. We're going to have it conform to the content protocol. Let's give it some basic attributes. Let's do the first one, and we'll say a post, which will be a string, and let's also add another property from. The way we should imagine this is that it will be something like post, hello world, and from, and it's just going to come from me. That's what we expect our JSON to be. Now our next step is we need to fix our response. Now this response, as we see, is just a string. Now what we want to do is create an instance of the response object. I'm just going to create an empty instance. We need to give it access to a container. Containers we'll talk about a little bit further in another video. But the idea is that your entire application surrounds this idea of containers, these basic pockets that hold on to your functionality of your application. The container we're going to use here is a request container. Now, our next step is to use our instance of response, use its content, and we want to encode some content. And so let's create an instance of our context, and let's say hello world, say Johan. And finally, let's return our response. The last step in this process is to show that our closure will return a response. So we're just going to give the response type. So let's break this down. So we can see that there's this request-response cycle. First, we're getting in a request. We don't actually need to look into request to see any information, but typically be diving into this request object. We're saying we're going to return a response. We then defined this one-off context struct that will allow us to just generate an instance of a context that conforms to the content protocol. The reason we do this is because anything that conforms to the context protocol is able to be converted to and from JSON. So in the case of line 21, we can encode it into JSON, or if it was coming in as JSON from the request, we can decode it. Now, last thing we need to do is to add try. The reason we're adding try here is that the encoding method throws. What that basically means is that there's a bit of error handling here. Unlike, just like typically giving us a nil if this encoding fails, basically we use try to say that since this method can throw, right, this public function routes can throw, anything that like needs the error handling here should just be marked with try. You'll find that this is a pretty common pattern in Vapor. You'll see it a lot, where things like encoding that could fail typically will give us some kind of try. The reason for this is that in the chance that it fails for some reason, Vapor steps in to give us something along the lines of like abort bad request or some kind of better error handling, so the user doesn't just see a broken application. Let's run this. Now let's go back and let's rerun it. And there we have it. We have some JSON. Awesome. Now let's take this another step further. Typically in RESTful routing, you expect to see the following. You expect that there are a list of routes. So for example, /post will typically be our get route, and it usually will show us all of the posts. That's kind of what we expect. RESTful routing is a paradigm that is used by programmers to establish a convention in terms of how we do our routing. If we went to /post but send a post request, the expectation is that this will create a new post for us. And we can actually continue with this. If we went to post ID and it was a get, this will show us the post at ID. Now, what you should be noticing is that there's a bit of a commonality around kind of just like this, post route or resource as it's called. So what we're going to see is that there's a way for us to group these together. So let's first start with our router. Let's group them. We're going to throw in the path. It's going to be posts. And the group method here is going to give us access to our router object by default configured to work with posts. So let's add post. And let's take everything we had from here. Let's throw it in. Now the one gotcha here is that we now have to define these routes here. Now notice that we've changed the route. Now it's /. The expectation here is that we're going to post /. Let's take all of this, put it here, and let's remove this redundant route. So just to recap, we grouped all of our routes around post. This gives us access to this post router, and from there we define our routes grouped by posts. Let's run this. Let's go back, and we should get the same exact results. Now what you should probably be realizing is that putting everything in the routes file is probably going to get a bit unsustainable. What we're going to do in a future video is start writing these controllers. Now all a controller is that it's set up to take this method, so the typical get with our path, and then we have it correspond with an action on our controller. So let's go take a look. Notice, and some of this will be unfamiliar to you because we have not gotten into futures as yet, but you can kind of look at it and see that it makes sense. This is our index action, takes in the request as we expect, returns a to-do, and all it's doing is querying all to-dos. You can see create, pretty similar, decodes a to-do, and then saves it. So we can imagine that a to-do is sent in as some form of JSON, and then we're using that JSON to create a new instance of to-do, and then we're saving it. We're going to get into this in a future video in much more depth, but for now, let's stay with our grouping.